Bagels are not one of the most iconic breakfast foods. I don't know what is. This year has been full of people baking, and what better way to embrace home baking than to make our very own homemade bagels. I'm gonna walk you through the entire process of making bagels from start to finish so you don't have to be scared at all. If you're new around here, my name's Jessica, and on this channel we like to focus on the how and the why behind the baking and the cooking process. So today's video is gonna be a little bit different. I'm not only going to show you how to make bagels, but I'm also going to explain to you the reasons why we do the things we do when it comes to baking bagels. So sit tight, this is going to be a little bit longer video than usual, but I'll go ahead and throw some timestamps in the description box below if you scroll all the way to the bottom. So if you want to skip around the video, or if you need to look at a certain section again, that'll be an easy way to navigate the video. I also have tons more videos coming up throughout the year explaining the ins and outs to why we do the things we do in the kitchen. So if you like these kinds of videos, make sure to subscribe and stick around. I release new videos weekly. So how do you get delicious golden brown chewy bagels from a home oven? Well, you may be surprised to find out that there are a few tips and tricks when it comes to making bagels at home. So first thing, I want to start out by talking through all the equipment that you're going to need. Now you probably know if you've watched any of my other videos or read my blog that I don't like spending extra money that I don't need to spend. So when we talk about equipment, I'm only going to give you the pieces that are necessary for this process, as well as things that will serve you well in future baking projects. So don't feel like you need to invest in equipment that you're not going to use over and over again and that's just going to sit in your kitchen. What I want you to do is invest in things that you know you'll use over and over again, and things that are going to make your bagels really good. I'll leave a link to all of the products that we talk about in the description below, but also remember, if you're just kind of making these as a one-off project, you could always borrow supplies from either a friend or a family member who may have them laying around in their kitchen. The first piece of equipment that's going to be super necessary for a lot of baking projects, especially these bagels, is a kitchen scale. Bagels are made mostly of flour, and that's important because we need to be sure that the flour is measured accurately. When it comes to recipes, the recipe for these bagels that will be linked on my blog, I have the recipes in grams as well as in cups. But let me explain a little bit why grams is the best way to measure. Using a kitchen scale is going to be the most accurate way to get the exact measurement that you need every single time. When you measure flour, for example, how you scoop it really makes a difference in the end product. So let me show you an example. To measure flour the correct way, you need to first fluff up your flour using a spoon, and then gently scoop the flour into your measuring cup using that spoon. And then when you get to the top, leveling it off with a knife. That's the correct way to measure flour. Now compare that number to the number on the scale when you just simply scoop your flour out of the jar without fluffing it, without doing anything, and just packing it down in that cup. It's gonna weigh more. So if you're making this recipe by measuring your flour with cups rather than using a kitchen scale, make sure that you're measuring the correct way by fluffing the flour, leveling it off with a knife, rather than just scooping it directly from the flour jar. The next piece of equipment you'll find useful is an instant read thermometer. Now an instant read thermometer is going to be used while we're proofing our yeast. With active dry yeast, you have to rehydrate it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the important part is making sure that you're rehydrating it at a temperature that's not going to kill the yeast. So for our bagels, we want about 110 degrees Fahrenheit for the water before we proof our yeast. Make sure that you don't go above 138 degrees Fahrenheit, as that temperature is way too hot and will kill your yeast. Up next, we have a bench scraper, and if you're not familiar with this tool, it's basically like a dulled knife that has a handle on the end. This tool is useful for any baking project that involves dough, as well as if you cook a lot and need to scoop cut veggies off of your cutting board into a pot or a pan. It comes in handy then as well. A bench scraper comes in handy for this project because it helps us get uniform bagels by cutting bits of dough and making sure that all of our bagels are going to be the same size when they're done baking. I also really like this particular bench scraper because it has a ruler at the end, which comes in handy when we're measuring out our bagels to make sure that they've been stretched wide enough. You know that crunchy, crispy crust that we're used to eating when we bite into a bagel? Well, that texture takes a little bit of work to achieve with a home oven. One thing that aids in the process is using a baking stone. And this is the same baking stone that you would use for making pizza at home. It gives your crust a nice crispy exterior, and that's due to the high heat that is able to be easily transferred from the baking sheet. A baking stone will come in handy, especially if you love to bake bread or pizza at home. It's hard to get home ovens to the heat that industrial baking ovens get to. And so one trick is having this baking stone that allows us to achieve a similar outer texture that we all love. This next piece of equipment is not necessary, but trust me when I say it's going to make your life so much easier. The kneading process with bagels is an important step, as in with every dough, but especially with these bagels. And so having a stand mixer really helps A, not make your arms as tired, and B, helps the process go a little bit faster. So if you have a stand mixer with a dough hook, that will be super helpful for this process. Just be sure to read all the directions very carefully when you're using your stand mixer. I don't want to be responsible for anybody's stand mixer overheating or breaking. I just had to get mine fixed. It wasn't cheap. So make sure that you're careful when you're using your stand mixer to aid you in the kneading process. And the last thing you'll need, which you probably have laying around your kitchen anyways, is a baking sheet pan. And we use this, as you probably could imply from the name of the video, to proof our bagels overnight in the refrigerator. So just make sure that yours is able to fit comfortably in your refrigerator. In terms of our ingredients, there are going to be a few key things that you'll need in order to make bagels that taste like the ones we're all used to. Since bagels are mostly made of just flour and water, you really need to understand the science and the reason for using each of the key ingredients in the bagel recipe. If you remember one thing from this video, remember that one of the most important things to achieving a crunchy, chewy bagel is a high protein flour. So what does a high protein flour do? Well, it gives us that nice, crunchy, chewy texture that we like in breads such as bagels or even French baguettes. Typically, a high protein flour is going to be anywhere from 13.5% to around 14.5%. If you buy flour, some brands tend to label it on the outside of the bag. I know King Arthur flour, which I love, labels all of their products with the protein percent on the outside of the bag. So that can be helpful if you're shopping around at the store and want to check out which flour has a high protein. Now, as I ventured out into the world to try to find a high protein flour at a supermarket near me, I couldn't find anything. So I quickly realized that it was going to have to be special ordered, and I didn't really want that because if I can't find it, you probably can't find it either. So rather than going with a high protein flour, we went with the next best thing, which is bread flour. Still a high protein flour, just not as high. Usually it's around 12%. The protein in the flour is really going to affect the end texture of your baked good. So don't be tempted to use all-purpose flour. That's around 10% protein. You're not going to achieve the right consistency or probably be happy with the product. So in general, what you should remember is low protein flours are going to result in a more tender, flaky baked item, and higher protein flour is going to result in a more dense, chewy product. The next thing you're going to need is active dry yeast, and this is essential in any yeasted dough. Now, active dry yeast is produced so it lies dormant, and the way we wake it up is to rehydrate it by adding water. If you've had yeast in your fridge for a long time, it might not be good, so make sure that you pay attention later in the video where we will test to make sure your yeast is active and ready to go. And finally, the last iconic flavor in bagels is barley malt. Now again, this was a product that I couldn't find around me, so I wanted to make it easier, and today we're going to substitute barley malt for molasses. Molasses or barley malt aids in the bagel process in a few ways. It helps out with the proofing process. It also gives a nice sweetness to the bagel, as well as helps us achieve that dark brown crust that we all love on a bagel. So now that we've covered the equipment you need and the ingredients you need, we're ready to move on to the baking process and how you actually make your bagel. I love to know the how and the why because it really helps you gain understanding of why recipes say to do what they say. The first step is to scale your ingredients. Now, I wish I could stand here and tell you that with every single recipe I do, I always make sure to have everything in place or mise en place before I get started on the recipe. That's not exactly true, but with baking, it helps so much in the process. So what I would suggest is read through the recipe in full. That's gonna help make sure that you understand what steps come in what order and you're kind of ready for the process that lies ahead. I would also suggest that you scale out all of your ingredients and add them into little bowls or cups so it's easy to just go through the recipe and have everything already weighed out. Like we chatted about earlier, the most important step in this process is to make sure that you are scaling your flour correctly. So like we talked about, if you need to measure with cups, make sure that you're fluffing your flour, spooning it into your measuring cup, and leveling it off with a knife. You know the drill by now. I'll also link some of my favorite small bowls and containers that I use to measure out all my ingredients. It's useful to have these kind of laying around your kitchen. After you've scaled your ingredients, the next step is proofing your yeast. Like we talked about, proofing our yeast makes sure that A, it's still alive, and B, that we can rehydrate it and wake it up for the baking process. To do this, you need to slowly heat your water up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to do this over the stove. It's just a gentler way of doing it, and you're gonna ensure that you don't overheat your water. You can also use your instant read thermometer to ensure that you're getting the exact temperature that you need. Once the water is heated up, go ahead and transfer it to a glass bowl along with the molasses and your yeast. You'll stir all of that up and then give it about 5 minutes to get nice and bubbly and foamy on the top. If at 5 minutes your yeast doesn't look like this, then you probably need to give it about another 5 minutes to see if anything happens. If you still don't see foam and bubbles on the top, that probably means that your yeast is dead and you need to go to the store and grab some new yeast. If it's foamy, you are perfect and ready to move on to the next step. Next up, we're ready to start mixing our dough. So place your flour and your salt in your stand mixer along with the dough hook and give that a good mix so you can kind of combine the salt and the flour. Next, you'll add the yeast mixture and place your mixer on low and start allowing a dough to form. This process takes a hot minute, so don't give up if it doesn't happen right away. Make sure that you keep your mixer on low so the flour doesn't spin up everywhere, and you can scrape down the sides of the bowl as needed. As more of the flour kind of starts to incorporate, you can turn your mixer up to a little bit higher speed until you get a shaggy dough that's formed and most of the flour is combined and in one solid ball. At this point, we are going to set a timer for 10 minutes and move our mixer speed up to medium-high. Probably around 6 or 7 if you have a KitchenAid mixer. What we're doing throughout this process is developing the gluten. With bagels, it's actually really hard to overknead your dough. More likely the case is that you'll underknead it and you'll have problems with improper texture, lack of blisters on the top of your bagels when they're baked, and not the right consistency. You really want to make sure throughout this process that you are giving it the full 10 minutes to knead and for that gluten to develop. I do also want to mention if your mixer at any point seems like it's overheating or struggling, don't break your mixer. You can always start to hand knead or give your mixer some time to cool down and then restart it. Now I want to actually show you the process of the gluten developing. so you can see how the dough changes as we give it more time to knead. So first up, this is what the dough looks like after it's been kneading for 2 minutes. You can see it easily tears apart, there's not much stretch to it. We know at this point it is definitely not done. As we get a little bit further into the process, at about that 5-minute mark, it's starting to become a little bit more stretchy. When you pull it apart, it seems to stretch a little bit, but then kind of tears easily at the end. We're getting there, but we're not quite to the point where the dough needs to be, so keep letting it go for that last 5 minutes. What we're looking for is a thin, flexible dough that doesn't tear when we pull it apart, but rather stretches, and you can get it almost to kind of a thin consistency before it breaks. If you've made dough at home before, you're probably used to this consistency, and you can tell by eyeing it when it's done. If you're new to this whole process, don't worry, it's gonna take some time to achieve, but my biggest advice is to go by our test of stretching it out rather than by time. It's a lot better to follow indicators when baking rather than an exact time limit, because depending on your environment, different things in baking can just vary, and I want you to be able to get the best product possible, so that's why you need to go by indicators. So to help you out a little bit, this is what your final dough should look like when you mess around, stretch it out, and play with it. Once you've achieved the proper consistency, what you'll need to do is grab a clean bowl, add the dough in there, cover it with plastic wrap really tightly, and allow it to rise in a warm, draft-free place for about an hour or until it doubles in size. For a test to check that your dough has risen enough, you can take a finger, poke it in the dough, about up to your knuckle, and then if that indentation remains, your dough is ready. If not, allow it to rise a little bit more and you can repeat the test until the dough is fully ready. Once your dough has doubled in size, we're now moving on to the shaping of the bagel process. Before we do this, grab your dough and gently punch it down. What this does is deflate some of the gas that built up during the rising process. It seems counterintuitive, but the reason for this is so we can get a better, finer grain on our baked good, as well as redistribute some of those yeast cells so that way they can help puff up the bagels during the final proving process. In order to shape the bagels, you need to measure out 113 grams of dough and roll that into a ball. You should be able to get 12 bagels from one batch of dough. I find it easiest to measure out all of the dough, roll it into a ball, and then move on to the shaping process. In order to shape the bagels, you'll grab a ball of dough and insert your thumbs into the middle of the dough to form a hole. And then you'll stretch out the bagel and continue to make it wider until it reaches 4 inches long. This is where your bench scraper comes in handy, so that way you can measure and make sure each donut is consistent. We want to make sure that they're big enough, because if your hole is too small and you haven't stretched it to that full 4 inches, during the boiling and the baking process, the hole in the middle of the donut will close up. I should also mention that throughout this whole process, you'll want to be sure to cover your dough with a tea towel or a kitchen towel to make sure that nothing dries out. Now it's time to proof our bagel dough, and this is the final rise before your bagels go into the oven. In order to make sure that your bagels don't stick, grab your baking sheet and cover it generously with ground cornmeal. I like to use a thick ground cornmeal, and this gives a nice texture to the bottom of the bagels in addition to making sure it doesn't stick. In terms of the proofing process, this is where bagels differ from many other types of baked goods. For good quality bagels, you want to allow your bagels time to ferment in a cold environment. This is why the recipe is called overnight bagels. At this point, we are going to put the bagels in the refrigerator and allow them to ferment overnight for about 12 to 14 hours. What this is gonna do is going to give us extra added flavor to our bagel by allowing everything time to meld together. Before you put your bagels in the refrigerator, make sure that you tightly wrap everything with plastic wrap. Make sure that you do a good job on this, because failure to wrap them tightly will result in this hard crust that forms on the bagel, like you see here, and we definitely don't want that. You want nice fluffy bagels, so just make sure to kind of take your time during this step and fully wrap everything. So now that you've had a good night's sleep and you are ready to start baking again, in the morning we are first going to start out by doing a float test. This is something people often do with bagels to make sure that they've had enough time to proof and that they're ready to bake. Because we've allowed the bagels to proof overnight, you're probably not going to have a problem with this step, but I always just like to double check just to kind of ensure our work and do the whole math thing where you do a problem and then check it to make sure that you're right. So what you can do for this process is grab a bowl of lukewarm water. You can even put it in your Dutch oven that you'll use to boil the bagels later, and you'll gently place one of the bagels on top of the water. If it floats, you are ready to go and it is proofed properly. If it sinks to the bottom, allow the bagels to sit on the counter for a little bit and warm up. You'll want to give them about 15 minutes to warm up and then recheck to see if they float. Keep rechecking every 15 minutes until they have fully proofed and they are ready to go. We're now moving on to that iconic boiling process of bagels. So why do we boil bagels? Well, in order to achieve that shiny, crunchy texture on the outside of the bagel, you have to boil your bagel. The longer you boil your bagel, the thicker and chewier your crust will be. So put some water on the stove and allow it to come to a boil. I usually like to start this process at the same time that I'm heating up my baking stones in the oven. Allow the water to come to a steady boil and then you'll add in a couple tablespoons of molasses. What you're looking for is to achieve a dark brown color, almost as if you're making black tea. At this point, you're ready to boil your bagels, so take out your bagels and put them in your pot of boiling water. Don't overcrowd the pan. Depending on the size, you may be able to fit 2 to 4, but make sure it's not overcrowded. Allow the bagels to boil for about 30 seconds on each side. I set a timer because I want to make sure to achieve the exact consistency that I want. If in between the batches you see that the water is kind of slowing down and it's not as steady of a boil, make sure to give it time to come to a complete boil. It also comes in handy to have a drying rack similar to the one that you use for baking and cooling your baked goods. You can grab one of these and allow the bagels to sit there and drain off any excess water that may come off of them. From here, you can now add any toppings that you want to the tops of your bagels. This is really what I love about this recipe. Because it's plain, you can dress it up for your exact preferences of what you like. Some bagel toppings that I like to use are everything but the bagel seasoning, poppy seeds, sesame seeds, minced onion, or if you just want to keep it nice, plain, and simple, you can just top with some sea salt. Now we are finally onto the last step, and that is to bake our bagels. So like I mentioned earlier, I like to preheat my oven as well as my baking stones during the boiling process. That way you can kind of make things go a little bit faster. Make sure that when you're setting up your oven, you adjust the racks inside. So you want to move one rack to the top third and one rack to the bottom third. With all home ovens, you have different hot spots at different areas. It just kind of depends on your particular oven where the hot spots will be. But the reason that we move our racks is so you can get a nice, crispy, crunchy outside and make sure that it's even throughout all the bagels. So once your baking stones are heated, you'll carefully take them out of the oven. They're super hot, so make sure to use hot pads or a towel and bring it over to a spot where it can rest while it's hot, and place your bagels a few inches apart. From there, you're gonna add the bagels back into the oven for 15 minutes, and there you go, you did it. You made bagels at home. From here, all you need to do is allow your bagels to completely cool, and then you can choose what you want to do with them. Of course, if you want to dig in right away, they would be perfect to eat by themselves or make a bagel sandwich. Those were a favorite of mine when I was a kid. You can also store them by freezing them, and this is what I like to do because we don't tend to eat bread fast enough, especially because my husband's gluten-free and he can't eat them. I personally cannot eat the bagels fast enough before they go bad. They'll usually last around 3 to 4 days if you just keep them out on your counter in a sealed container. But if you want to preserve their life a little bit longer, you can store them in a freezer safe bag and put them in the freezer for up to 6 months. What I like to do if you're storing them in the freezer is cut them in half, and then all you have to do is grab your 2 halves of the bagel, pop them in the toaster, and you're ready for breakfast. Now this wouldn't be a Homebody Eats video if I didn't link you additional resources to look at in case you want to dig a little bit deeper into the science behind the bagel making process. So I'll leave those in my blog post that I wrote up everything we talked about today, and that will be in the description below. I hope you found this video helpful. The baking process can definitely be confusing, and there's a lot of science that unless you really dig into it, you may not know why you do the things you do. So stick around and subscribe if you want to see more videos like these. And as always, thanks for sticking around and hanging out with me today. Until the next time, I'll see you later.